scene setting. I am the Director of the Youth Law Program at WEstjustice, but I'm also very privileged to be the co-convener of Smart Justice for Young People. Smart Justice is an amazing innovation that was established by Youth Law in 2011 and supported by the Victorian Legal Services Board, in addition, and the Kimberley Foundation have supported it along the way. And really, we must acknowledge the vision of Ariel Couchman, the Youth Law CEO, and also my long-time sector colleague and friend, Tiffany Overall, who convened, there was no co-convention, who convened Smart Justice for all these years and sadly retired last year. So the objective of Smart Justice for Young People was to create a coalition that could advocate jointly. And currently it has 50 cross-discipline and cross-sector members supporting young people in contact with the criminal justice system as part of its membership. Smart Justice for Young People has 4 goals, which include ending the overrepresentation in the criminal justice system of particular youth cohorts. And so, on that note, in 2021, we set up a working group dedicated to actually figuring out how on earth we were going to set about achieving this quite an aspirational goal. And we have met monthly since that time, and I would like to thank each and every member of that working group who has gone above and beyond in terms of thought leadership, editing work, and just really leaning into and making this action plan something that we are really proud of. So thank you. Okay, so a bit more about the action plan. It is the culmination of 2 years of effort with endorsement from 22 coalition members as well as individuals. And its key aim is to end the chronic overrepresentation of 5 groups of children and young people in the criminal justice system. The approach is unprecedented because it takes a system level approach as opposed to a program or service level approach. And the action plan contains 49 system level rights-based asks, and 9 that cover the whole of government and 40 across 6 key portfolios. And in terms of how we settled on the ultimate 49 asks, we based it on available data and the cross-sector experience of the members, and also from all of the literature that was in circulation. And what it calls for, one of its principal aims, is shared responsibility across government, statutory agencies, and us, government-funded organisations. And what it also does is focus on the root causes of overrepresentation, which include the overcriminalisation and underserving of these 5 cohorts in the sectors, in addition to the criminal justice system, or other than the criminal justice system. And one thing that's really important to note that we have identified and focus on 5 key overrepresented of the 5 key cohorts, but we acknowledge that there are other groups that are overrepresented. For example, children and young people with cognitive disability. So we acknowledge that this is not an exhaustive list, but also more importantly, that there's overlap between the 5 cohorts as well that we have identified. So what's the problem? In Victoria right now, there is a chronic overrepresentation in the criminal justice system of First Nations children and young people, multicultural children and young people, children in residential care, girls and young women with complex needs, and 18 to 25-year-olds. The problem is urgent and requires our immediate attention. And the reasons for this overrepresentation are complex, and no one organisation or government department can end it alone. In terms of the problem and some clues and the evidence that we drew upon to come up with the asks, the Youth Parole Board report told us last year that 52%, for example, children in custody had current or previous child protection involvement. 64% had a history of trauma, abuse or neglect. 42% had experienced family violence. 82% had a history of use or misuse of drugs. And 24% had an active cognitive disability diagnosed by a professional. And 28% had a history of self-harm or self-ideation. And in 2019-20, 68% were recorded as being suspended or expelled from school. So these clues and this evidence and these data points contributed to the crafting and the development of the asks and the identification of the portfolios that we ultimately landed on in the action plan. I did a quick scan of the recent headlines, online headlines, and provide us with further clues in terms of why kids in custody may be experiencing these things. You know, we're talking about recently, I think a couple of days ago, there was an OECD report that talked about Australia having the second highest rate of cyberbullying, and that girls are struggling the most with cyberbullying. Our public hospitals are in crisis. We've been discussing the problem of family violence that remains a scourge in terms of women and children in our country. We've been talking about the cost of prisons and homelessness. These headlines and the content of these stories and the data that's been kind of emanating kind of provided us with a further basis, an explanation for why kids are experiencing overrepresentation, or some kids more than others, and also why we chose the 49 asks that we did. In terms of the problem is complex. So we identified that one of the key issues is that typically we have treated overrepresentation in the criminal justice system as a justice problem alone, as opposed to a whole of government cross-sector issue. Also, that resource allocation, not just in the criminal justice system, but across the service systems, are focused on the acute end of the service spectrum as opposed to prevention. For example, law enforcement, emergency department hospital admissions, statutory child protection intervention, child removal and incarceration. As well, attitudes and biases, conscious and unconscious, held by decision makers and that affect the use of discretion, competitive short-term grant cycles, funding insecurity for programs and services, and the fact that we operate in silos. So not just by sector, but also focusing on, and understandably, because the work needs to be done, but focusing on the individual groups of young people who are focused in the, who are overrepresented in the criminal justice system. So for example, children in residential care, and as opposed to a shared focus on what these 5 groups have in common. A lack of consistent data collection and the measurement of impact of programs and services for these cohorts. And what this means and what we have kind of deduced is that there are all of these amazing pieces of work that our organisations are doing, that government has underway, but there isn't right now, as we see it, a meaningful way to thread them all together. So what our action plan does, or seeks to do, is to demonstrate how simultaneously fixing the system level issues will deepen the impact of this government work and community sector work that is underway. Other problems, I've listed them there. They cover the impact of certain criminal and civil justice laws, policies and practices, policing approaches to these 5 cohorts, including over-policing, the way we view community crime prevention and reintegration, an over-reliance by police, by community-based institutions to deal with challenging behaviour by young people, the way we view and undertake our work to support families, and in particular the families of these young people who are overrepresented in the criminal justice system, and also government funding too, and service decisions by community organisations. So what we have here is a bit of an indication of how we approached the asks and why we ended up landing and deciding on the asks that we did. And so you'll see in those very nice colourful circles there that we focused in the action plan on the education sector, health and wellbeing, policing, the criminal and civil justice systems, children, families and their community, and also housing and material needs. And within those different sectors, we highlighted and kind of sought to address the conditions that are holding overrepresentation of these young people in place. And when we talk about, we just covered off on those problems that I highlighted. The action plan is premised on the fact that there are policies, practices, resource flows, relationships, power dynamics, and mental models that are holding overrepresentation of these kids in place. And the purpose of the action plan is to seek to kind of shift those conditions, and so that we can set about trying to achieve our objective.
Yeah.
I guess one of the key things that we've realised along the way is that maybe it's not just the other people who are part of the problem. Maybe it's not just government, but maybe it's us as well, which is a hard thing to come to terms with, but it's such an important recognition to actually reach, and also an empowering one as well. And the good news is that as part of this action plan, what we realised is that us in the community sector, actually have a number of levers that we can pull to actually influence and contribute to the ending of the overrepresentation of the 5 cohorts that we've identified in the action plan. And that's in terms of who we service, when we service them, how we service, the objectives we put in our strategy docs, the data we collect, the funding we apply for, and whom we apply with. These are all levers that we have at our disposal and don't require any new resources. And this kind of image gives us a sense of also another one of the solutions. It's not the only solution, but also seeking a redistribution or reinvestment of resources, both in terms of our own organisation's time and effort from the crisis and entrenchment end of the spectrum to the prevention and intervention, early intervention side of the spectrum. And it's always good, after setting out a series of problems, to end on an optimistic and achievable note that on the left side of that screen, you'll see what the current social system looks like. You know, we're operating in silos, funding's unaligned, decisions made outside communities who are affected by the problem, in our case, overrepresentation. And then what a better one looks like, more effective use of the resources that we have, community being central to leadership, collective structures, and an alignment of systems and strategies and long-term funding to a common goal, which in our case is to end the overrepresentation of children and young people living in residential care, 18 to 25-year-olds, First Nations children and young people, multicultural children and young people, and girls and young women with complex needs. Thank you.